one, just raise your hand and give me and announce. First of all, somebody took me aside on the way out and said that the only person who I used the family name for was Uri, the man, and all the women got the first name only. And for the past 30 years, my consciousness has been significantly raised by a professional feminist who lives with me. And I should know better. I apologize. Please don't tell her. I promise not to do it again. Iris wanted to announce that all of the guests, the Palestinian guests, are asked to stay for a few minutes after the conference, come to the lobby, and sit or stand with Iris. Where are you, Iris? Okay, there she is. Iris Dotan. Kat? Dotan Kat. Okay. And to give us some feedback and to make sure that you have a way back. Because we have lost a little bit of the you know how Israelis are. We need to control. So we lost a little bit of that. So we just want to make sure you know your way. You have a way back, and also we want you to give us some feedback. And yes, and the people who volunteered to take them wherever they're going, also to come to this short meeting. And we need volunteers also for tomorrow, she says. So please be in touch with Iris about that. Iris Kotan Katz. There is also Anat, I think it was Anat, who wanted to make an announcement about Shigir. Okay, hang on. Where is Anat? She wanted to talk about a narrative group for people in conflict, and she wanted to make sure the Palestinians knew about this. And she wanted to find somebody who would say so in Arabic, so she might come back sooner or later and do that. Somebody else, what else was I supposed to do? That's everything? Oh, this is Anat. Okay, do you want to say something, or do you want somebody to say it in Arabic? You want to come up to the microphone, or just say from where it is?
לעמוד פה. אני עינת מרנין, אני חברה פסיכואקטיב וחברה בפורום משפחות השכולות. וביקשתי ממנה לעזור לי לתרגם לערבית, כדי שזה ייאמר בעברית וערבית ולא באנגלית. יש לנו פרויקט מאוד מיוחד של פורום המשפחות השכולות, של היכרות עם האחר, באמצעות מפגשים דיאלוגיים שנערכים לקבוצות עם אפיונים מיוחדים ממכנה משותף. אחת הקבוצות הבאות שיהיו היא קבוצה של אנשי בריאות הנפש.
أنا منال من ثقافتي عناد عم تحكي عن مشروع اللي عم تعملوه فورم العائلات التاكلة اللي عم يدوروا بالمرحلة هاي على أشخاص عندهم الصحة النفسية، أخصائيين نفسيين من الضفة الغربية على أساس يعملوا مجموعة للديالوج للحوار مع المجموعة الإسرائيلية والمجموعة العربية.
במיוחד מחפשים לקבוצה הקרובה אנשי בריאות הנפש פלסטינים מהגדה, שיהיו מעוניינים לשמוע ולהצטרף לקבוצה הזו.
كنت حكيت انه البحث بهاي المرحله لاخصائيين نفسيين من الضفه الغربيه على اساس انه اذا معنيين انه يسمعوا يشاركوا بهيك مجموعه بحوار مع المجموعه الاسرائيليه.
לגבי ישראלים, ליאורה לוחשת לי פה מלמטה, התשובה שקיבלתי מהארגון שלנו שאנשי פסיכואקטיב קרובים מדי לעשייה, מחפשים אנשים עם דעות מגוונות ובקיצור ימניות יותר. אז אם יש בקהל אנשים כאלה או היכרות לאנשים כאלה שמפגש כזה יכול היה לקדם אותם לכיוון של היכרות ודיאלוג, אנחנו מאוד נשמח.
Our next speaker is Lynn Siegel, and she has been engaged in left and feminist politics since coming to London in the early 1970s. She's currently a professor in psychosocial studies at Birkbeck College, University of London. She's written many books on gender, masculinity, and sexuality. Her most recent books are Making Trouble, Life and Politics and Out of Time, Pleasures and Perils of Aging. This book, by the way, she didn't mention it in her bio, is number 3 on which bestseller list? I guess it's
Critical theory.
In what?
Critical theory.
Critical theory bestseller list? There's such a thing. Okay. What does that mean? It sold 7 books? Okay, it's number 3 on the critical theory bestseller list. And I thought New York Times or something like that. She was one of the founders of both Jews for Justice and Palestinians and independent Jewish voices in the UK. And she will talk about resisting despair in memory of Dr. Eyad El-Sarraj.
Jews for Justice for Palestinians, and then independent Jewish voices. There's other ones as well. That will do. Okay, well, it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here and to greet the Palestinians who did manage to make it from Gaza and the West Bank, and above all, to pay homage to Dr. Eyad El-Sarraj, whose legacy helps us still to face up to the scandals of what I see as the appalling present, clinging to his dream of a just and peaceful future. And I'm sorry to be bringing despair back into the room. I was criticized for it last night, but there you are. It's going to come along. And I do recall that Eyad himself could always grasp at the tiniest thread of hope. So determined was he to maintain a willful optimism. He was, can you hear me? It seems to be pointing up above my head. Is that better? Yeah. Oh, right, it's designed for a man. He was even hopeful, I remember, when Hamas won the municipal elections in Gaza in 2005, suggesting that, like other radical movements, this would moderate their militancy, focusing them more on security and welfare. We know what happened next, as the EU and the USA joined Israel in trying to smash this newly elected government, withholding tax revenues and foreign aid. As so often in Palestine, this produced the surreal situation in which, as Avi Shleim noted, sanctions were imposed not against the occupier, but against the occupied, not against the oppressor, but against the oppressed. Things could only get worse, and very quickly did, even as Eyad himself struggled to embody the structure of feeling always promoted by that early New Left British thinker, Raymond Williams, who, in his very last book, called Resources for Hope, said, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible, rather than despair convincing." making despair convincing is a lot of what goes on here. That's what I'd like to do myself, though, to make hope convincing. That is why I'm here and what I want to do and what I find it so very hard to do. Trying to address my chosen topic, when I was first thinking about what to say, I kept thinking it's too hard. I don't know how to resist despair because every year I have watched from afar as things have got worse. What would it be like to be living in Gaza or the West Bank or even to be a Palestinian in Israel? Perhaps right now it's just a matter of surviving despair, which in itself, of course, is a type of resistance. That's my first thread of hope. It was only completing my talk that I came across John Berger writing about his visit to Palestine, which he came here 8 years ago. He went to Palestine 8 years ago, and surrounded by rubble on all sides, including the rubble of words, the difficulty of talking about, the tragedy of the situation he was in. What he reported finding amongst the Palestinians he met was what he called an undefeated despair. Undefeated despair. And perhaps this is best summed up in what Samar mentioned earlier, sumud, steadfastness despite all. For despair is obviously just what Israeli policy has been designed to instill in Palestinians from the very beginning, whether forcing them to flee or watching loved ones imprisoned, injured or killed. It is pointless to resist. It is pointless to resist, is their message. Therefore, for so many Palestinians, resistance is, first of all, about surviving despair. That's what Eyad himself used to say when he wrote 13 years ago of the long path of humiliation and despair that lies behind the creation of the so-called terrorists. The struggle of many Palestinians is, he said, how not to become suicide bombers. And this is what he tirelessly sought to prevent when he stood implacably against violence, whether taking the form of Palestinian resistance or against the infinitely deadlier modes of Israeli state violence. That eye for an eyelash, as Avi Shleim again put it, an eye for an eyelash. Again, as Jessica mentioned earlier, Eyad liked to insist that the Israelis and the Palestinians needed each other because only the Palestinians can release Israel from its moral guilt, from all that has gone wrong since their first Zionist dreams, to the nightmare of living in a country forever at war with its neighbours, while only the Israelis, of course, can negotiate a just peace with Palestine, allowing them control over their own affairs and therefore lay the basis for security, freedom and dignity for both sides. He was surely right, but in the meantime, as clinicians know only too well, guilt fuels aggression. Yes, guilt is usually the first cause of aggression, and then the greater the aggression, the more total the demonization towards its victims, those triggering the guilt. Once upon a time, Frantz Fanon said that in the colonial situation, the black man, here the Palestinian, is not recognized. This denial of recognition is the master saying, I do not see you at all, or pretending, I do not see you at all. That it's not just that one treats, it's not just how one treats another, but how you look at them. That is so destructive. That look can shatter the person. Thus Fanon tells us that racism is alive on the skin. Obviously, you only have to be a Palestinian trying to get through a checkpoint to know that. It is certainly still mechanisms of denial and projection that drive most Israeli perceptions of Palestinians, resulting in the complete normalcy of violence always in the air. What else can we think? When your own Likud president, Reuven Rivlin, declares Israel a sick society, you don't have to take it from outsiders. It's your own president saying Israel is a sick society. What else can we think when every form of non-violent Palestinian resistance is always met by Israeli violence? Yet, that's this cycle of violence. They're not particularly good things, but the worse you behave, the more guilty you feel, the more you justify it, and you behave even worse. Yet, despite the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians arrested, the tens of thousands killed over the last half-century, Israel still sees no reason to change course. Here I think of Martin Luther King, that other man so committed to non-violence, who wrote from a Birmingham jail when arrested for asking for the vote for black men in 1963. I've almost reached the conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate. Here, substitute the Israeli moderate, more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers the absence of tension to peace and justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek. Shalom is, after all, your greeting on both sides. Shalom, peace. But I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, asking for it. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill, he said, is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. So I'd like any liberal Zionist to reflect on that. Yet, if survival is indeed the bottom line for Palestinian resistance, facing such frustration, those whose spirits have not been entirely crushed by occupation also like to invert the slogan, to exist is to resist. There they are, walled up, not able, not does, and not able to reach the West Bank, and vice versa. To exist is to resist. And there's all those pictures of ladders going up over the wall, waving a Palestinian flag. Oh, you know all the ways people try to resist non-violently. Survival is also the underpinnings of the angry but gentle writing of Raja Shahadi, who I've also had the pleasure of meeting, the founder of the pioneering independent Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq in Ramallah in 1979. He writes in his most recent book, Occupation Diaries, Israel might be succeeding in planting their settlements in our midst, yet whatever policy Israel is following, it cannot succeed in the end. Not only because of the resilience we have acquired over many years of struggle, but because of the more simple fact that we too are not going anywhere. Somehow, the Israeli state thinks it can get rid of its Palestinian problem. It can't. Shahadi has written often of the sorrow created by that terrible war, keeping Palestinians not just cut off from Israel, but from each other. Watching the countless humiliations and pain Israeli restrictions place upon Palestinian lives daily, Shahadi concludes, I became more and more convinced that we are living next to a mad people, where even the veneer of civilization and decency has entirely vanished. Giving the Edward Said Memorial Lecture in London a few months ago, Shahadi quoted Naftali Bennett's contemptuous image of Palestinians as mere shrapnel in Israel's backside. But can it be true, he wondered, that with its excessive violence, Israel can really live forever with the poisonous toxins it creates in its own backside? not sure when Shahadi's conclusions are shared by ever more people worldwide. Celebrating Jewish New Year 2 months ago, Netanyahu repeated his country's favourite delusion. Israel will remain a beacon of freedom and human rights in an intolerant area, a source of pride and strength for Jews, no matter where they live. There's madness. It's not just that huge protests against Israel's war on Gaza occurred in almost every major city in the summer, with 85% of Britons criticising it, but dissenting voices arose even from Israel's usual supporters. We see daily in our papers what is happening over here, heightened every year or so as they mow the lawn, as one writer put it, go in with their most intense savagery. And we wonder, can this really go on? So why haven't we from the outside been able to pressurize Israel to end its madness from the outside? Well, it hasn't been entirely for want of trying, though of course it's connected to who is not trying. So let's look back. Sometimes our best efforts at peace are betrayed. One of the heroes of my youth, James Baldwin, wrote in 1979 from the Black Civil Rights struggle. He was objecting to the enforced resignation of the then US ambassador at the UN under Jimmy Carter, the former Black Civil Rights leader Andrew Young. And guess why? He was sacked for secretly meeting with Yasser Arafat. Why was he meeting with Yasser Arafat? Well, Young's goal had been to try and persuade Arafat to accept once again, back in 79, the delay of an upcoming report that the UN's Division of Palestinian Rights was planning to present to the General UN Assembly, calling for the creation of a Palestinian state. But on learning of the meeting, Israeli pressure was so great that it forced Jimmy Carter, it's strange, isn't it, that it is so great, but it forced Jimmy Carter to sack his ambassador. Baldwin was angry at this surrender. No one really cared about the Jews when Hitler came to power, that's true. He wrote before concluding, the Palestinians have been paying the price for British colonial policy of divide and rule, and for Europe's guilty Christian conscience for more than 30 years. Well, add on an extra 35 years now and counting. For one thing is surely crystal clear, if it wasn't before. The state of Israel has never, ever been prepared to allow the world to recognize a Palestinian state, no matter how small the fragment of their own soil they still manage to inhabit. That land is occupied, and not by its residents, but by Israel, though Israeli Jews may never ever have set foot in the place apart from soldiers with rifles. The reason Israel has never been prepared to recognize any Palestinian state is not so much that it might threaten Israel. That threat could be negotiated in various ways. There's an infinite amount of colonial history where this has happened, but rather it delegitimizes the goal of militant Zionism. For this goal is not simply that Israel should be recognized as a Jewish state, belonging to the Jews who live here, extending civil rights to non-Jews, which is in its constitution, and is a minimum requirement for any democratic state, which Israel claims to be, but rather it belongs potentially to all the Jews of the world. That's many more than live here. The 7 million other Jewish people, like me, who have no desire ever to migrate to Israel. This ethnic autocracy was reinforced last month with cabinet acceptance of a bill defining Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, already hugely exacerbating racist attacks overall, not only against Palestinians, but against African workers and no doubt against Israeli Jews as well. No Israel is not a beacon to the world. It is an alarm bell because there's a lot of racism growing all around the world. It is an alarm bell of what is quintessentially undemocratic, unjust, intolerable. Moreover, it's this form of Zionism that so cunningly ensnares criticism of this form of militant Zionism that so cunningly ensnares criticism of Israel with accusations of anti-Semitism. Today, ruling bodies of the USA and EU manage to disregard the Palestinian deaths occurring almost daily, I wonder if that's why people are leaving, while deploring every Israeli fatality. I deplore both. Earlier this year, Eva Illich wrote, "Open Haaretz on any given day, and half or a third of its news items invariably revolve around the same two issues. People struggling to protect the good name of Israel, and people struggling against its violence and its injustices." Indeed, no one has ever called me a self-hating Australian because I abhor the current Australian government with its savage treatment of asylum seekers and harsh economic policies. I am an Australian. The idea is ludicrous, yet I am named a self-hating Jew for repudiating Israeli policy. The idea is as ludicrous as it is tragic, displacing criticism of Israel from the injustices it perpetrates onto those who refuse to be bystanders to brutality. It is doubly ludicrous when the reason some Jews argue for an immediate end to occupation and justice for Palestinians is invoking their Jewish identity. Ironically, the leader of this tribe is the great anti-identitarian philosopher Judith Butler, mentioned by Stephen, who counters her many traducers, by saying that it is Jewish scholarship that inspires her support for all forms of non-violent resistance to Israeli occupation. I was taught at every step in my Jewish education, she writes, that it is not acceptable to stay silent in the face of injustice. Like others before her, Butler notes that Israel today not only fails to provide any safe home for Jewish people, incites conflict between Jews and refuels anti-Semitism globally, but also willfully betrays Jewish traditions. These are no small crimes, explaining why many of Israel's fiercest critics are Jews. And our number is growing daily. Alongside Palestinian resilience, and Israeli, I will include you, absolutely, and Israeli. So, alongside, I've lost my track now, that's all right. Alongside Israeli, the Palestinian resilience, this is my own second main thread of hope. It is precisely as Jews that many condemn Israeli policies, the position that Butler elaborates in parting ways, Jewishness and the critique of Zionism. Starting from Edward Said's reflections on Jews and Palestinians as each a scattered people who have both suffered historical injustices, Butler summons diverse Jewish thinkers, who I haven't time to name here, to develop an ethics of cohabitation, again mentioned by Stephen. She turns in particular to Hannah Arendt and others, mapping out a Jewish ethics of cohabitation, one enabling Jews and Palestinians to live together in the land they occupy. I read a lot of Hannah Arendt in the 1940s, and it was all very interesting. Her worries then about what should be being done. The main thing that she thought should be being done was getting a Jewish army together to fight Hitler, but instead it was a Jewish army coming together to fight the Arabs in Palestine, which upset her very much. It is some notion of binationalism that Butler and others are revisiting today. This would in no way resemble the wretched reality of today's de facto binationalism, with Israel ruling by military force over millions of Palestinians. Instead, it could be, she argues, a radically democratic binationalism, one capable capable of building upon the immense heterogeneity of both the Jews and the Palestinians occupying this land. And Shahadi, in all of his writing, talks about the heterogeneity of Palestinians and how he goes out in Bethlehem or Hebron and thinks how different he is from other Palestinians who are there, except for the one thing that they share in the effects of occupation. So, in this future ideal, Israeli and Palestinian citizens would share civil rights and protection from violence, military or otherwise, something that would only become thinkable once colonial rule had ended. For Butler, such cohabitation is the true ethical obligation of Jewish belonging. To be a Jew, she writes, is to make one's way ethically and politically within a world of irreversible heterogeneity. Echoing Arendt again, Butler insists that to deny heterogeneity in a society, to deny heterogeneity, is to try to maintain the homogeneity of a nation will always be to follow the logic of fascism. And we know who's following that logic. Netanyahu, we're watching. Thus, what is extraordinary is that Butler's radical vision stems directly from her sense of Jewish belonging, just as many of us, myself included, feel especially called upon to fight for justice for Palestinians because of our Jewish identity or origin. Yet, that very same identification generates its antithesis, militant Zionist entitlement, securing only Jews, however secular, because many militant Zionists are secular, the only thing they know is that God gave them this land, even though they don't believe in God. But God nevertheless gave them exclusive rights to the biblical land of Israel with its fluid borders. This certainly tells us something about the powers and perils of identity claims. And Butler herself has been criticised, although she's well aware of the dangers of presenting her resistance to Zionism in terms of Jewish values, seeming to make them somehow superior. However, I suspect that it's never really possible to leave our identifications and personal histories out of our political trajectories, even when we think it is calm logic alone that dictates them. So as I said, I feel more called upon to think about the situation of Palestinians in this land because of being of Jewish origin and indeed being from the 19th century, coming from a family of anti-Zionists who were very worried about the creation of the State of Israel. So my grandfather, who was editor for 50 years of the first and only, at the time, only Jewish paper in Australia at the end of the 19th century up until the 1940s, fiercely stood against the creation of Israel as simply a Jewish state, worrying about what would happen to the Arabs and what would happen to the Christians in that state. The rest is history. Today, I read other plans for creating a peaceful future here from those who support the Two States, One Homeland initiative, which I mentioned down there. Maybe some of you know more about it than I do, including the geographer Oren Gishtafel, whom I also know, even though I can't pronounce his name, and others. And they set out, in a way I've no time to hear, the slow and complex political and juridical programs necessary for such a confederation to work, so that this land could truly become the cherished homeland of both Jews and Palestinians. It is possible, especially with help rather than hindrance from the outside. It's just never been seriously tried. In the meantime, every form of non-violent resistance from Palestinians, that's the one homeland. In the meantime, every form of non-violent resistance from Palestinians still meets with massive arrests and violence from the IDF. Yet despite everything, it continues, and you'll all know of the 10 long years of struggle, non-violent protests, marches that began in the West Bank of Berlin against the building of the wall through their city, despite some Jewish Israeli and international supporters coming regularly to Berlin, the Israeli response remains unchanged, only varying in its ferocity as unarmed civilians meet with life-threatening violence from armed soldiers recently stepped up, while their community leaders are continuously imprisoned. Similar demonstrations, of course, occur in other Palestinian villages supported by Combatants for Peace, Women and the Women's Peace Coalition, Anarchists Against the War, and you know all about them. Okay, I'm going to conclude now. I've worked with various British groups for peace for 15 years now, during which time the situation has only deteriorated. Hence the despair I have to fight against. Yet as we fail again to get the world to act. To get the world to act, we still keep protesting, because not to do so is too diminishing and deadly, whatever the future holds. Some people see more reason for hope today, and I try and hope with them. Our own UK and several European governments and even the EU Parliament has recently recognised the right to Palestinian statehood. Even John Kerry is mildly irritated with this country that the US so unstintingly sustains and arms. It's just upped its arms amount so recently. Hardly known for his optimism, Norman Finkelstein recently said he thinks that criticism of Israel has reached a tipping point, and in his latest book, Method and Madness, he promotes a Gandhian-style mass non-violent demonstration, suggesting, what if all Palestinians simply took to the streets in Gaza, objecting to the siege, stopped the illegal blockade of Gaza, and what if at the very same time the hundreds of thousands of supporters for Palestinian justice went to the UN headquarters in New York and in The Hague? What if that were tried? But non-violent resistance obviously takes much courage and huge inner resources, knowing the violence it meets with from the IDF. Also, non-violence can be found not only in actions but in words as well as in deeds. Poetry and beauty are always making peace, Mahmoud Darwish once wrote. When you read something beautiful, you find coexistence. It breaks down walls. I always humanize the other. I even humanize the Israeli soldier, as in his poem A Soldier Who Dreams of White Lilies, written just after the 67 war. Many Arabs criticize it, but he said, I will continue to humanize even the enemy. So I wanted to close with a poem for Eyad El-Sarraj by Muhammad Ali, because it reminds me of him, and it's called Revenge, and is why killing would never really work. So this is Revenge by At times, do you want me to stop, or can I read the poem? It's not too long. At times, I wish I could meet in a duel the man who killed my father and raised our home, expelling me into a narrow country. And if he killed me, I'd rest at last. And if I were ready, I would take my revenge. But if it came to light when my rival appeared that he had a mother waiting for him, or a father who put his right hand over his heart's place in his chest whenever his son was late, then I would not kill him, even if I could. Likewise, I would not murder him if it was soon made clear that he had a brother or sisters who loved him and constantly loved to see him, or if he had a wife to greet him and children who couldn't bear his absence, or if he had friends or companions, neighbours he knew, or allies from prison. But if it turned out that he was on his own, cut off like a branch from a tree, without kin or neighbours or friends, colleagues or companions, then I'd add nothing to his pain. Instead, I'd be content to ignore him when I passed him by on the street, as I convinced myself that paying him no attention in itself was a kind of revenge. That's right.
I'm going to ask Iris Zinger to come and talk a few minutes about, you noticed that I think that one of the speakers could not come today, and he had a film that he wanted to show. And Iris is now going to just present the website that you can get the film at, and if you say a few words about it.
I'll just briefly introduce myself as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. Yes, please come, I can't do these things. Who's going to put this up on screen for me? On screen, I'll start talking because we have the opportunity here to have a discussion. So I'm just going to take 10 minutes to sort of tell you about the film, which is based on the work of two activists for non-violent resistance. That is Bassam Aramin, Palestinian, and Itamar Shapira, an Israeli. And what they kindly did, I think more than kindly, they committed themselves to spending 5 years going through the process of how they moved from being violent warriors, violent hero warriors, to becoming non-violent activists and non-violent resistance. Thank you. I'm going to need you to click on for me in a minute. All right. So what we did, this is a question that's always interested me. What is it about some people that they actually can make that move out of denial, out of violence, and start and become committed to that? And what we have here is a website of a pedagogic film, which is actually for community intervention, based on the work of on the stories of Bassam and Itamar, and very nicely, very interestingly supplemented with Jessica Benjamin's psychopolitical commentaries and workshops which can be used in a whole spectrum of different community settings. And we invite you to join us both on the forum and to use the workshops and the whole intervention. Okay, I'm going to read very quickly, so forgive me. The film is the outcome of a 5-year explorative, qualitative research project in which Bassam and Itamar are painfully honest in the way they shared their internal and external experiences and reflections of violence until they became activists for non-violence. The film focuses on their two very different journeys. Of course, we're talking about occupation, occupier, occupied, different cultural and socio-economic settings. We have perpetrator-victim identities, which cross both the divide between both of them, and trauma. We have trauma, both of them had experienced trauma, one historical, although I do believe that Israeli soldiers are also, and the Israeli population is also exposed to trauma today. And of course we have the Nakba, which Bassam, he was born into the occupation, but nevertheless it's much closer than Itamar's. Okay, so just briefly, Itamar, the Israeli, what I want you to do, please, is to help or to take out the issues which we would call perhaps psychoanalytic, and of course socio-psychoanalytic and socio-political issues which we afterwards used in our film. We extracted them from their conversations, and we built our community interventions around that. And it's all open. Happy to hear everybody's and anybody's ideas about it. So, Itamar the Israeli describes a process of internalization of his Ashkenazi family and collective Holocaust narrative and the Israeli state narrative, which developed in him a desire to sacrifice himself. And I think we need to know a hell of a lot more about sacrifice. I see it as Tov Lamod B'Artzenu, of course. It's good to die for our country and for our family. But the whole area of sacrifice and denial, sacrifice about overcoming a fear of mortality,
or Winnicott's terror of annihilation, I think, is what is behind much of this idea of sacrifice. In other words, our body may die, but we live on in a collective conscious and unconscious of our group. Our task here is, how do we prioritize life over sacrificing ourselves to death? Itamar didn't die. He sacrificed his good self when he participated in killing a jeep full of Palestinian policemen. In deep reflection, he describes his journey through sacrifice, joy at being a killer hero, his dissociation from the dead Palestinians, and his disconnection from himself. After his army service, he reconnects to his perpetrator self, seeing himself as a Nazi, that's his words, through Palestinian children's eyes. He can't imagine his blood-stained hands loving or caressing a woman or child. That was a very, very painful conversation we had. Later, he finds a cognitive dissonance between his IDF colonel father's stories of 1948 and the reality. Itamar recognizes his father's denial and subsequently his own. He says the lies he was told by the education system, the state, the army, and his parents were even more painful than being a killer. He asks, why would anyone want to live after he has killed so many people? And of course we know about veterans who go into deep depression and suicide. Itamar changed his identity. He stopped being an Israeli, a Jew, a Zionist. He is a non-violent, he calls himself a non-violent citizen of the world. In future, only he will choose when it is moral to use violence. His resistance is to the narrative and social conditioning of his own people. He is supported by being in community, luckily for him, with his two brothers, you may know, Zohar and Yonatan Shapira. I'm talking about Itamar Shapira. And later with Combatants for Peace. And we have one whole chapter from Jessica about the role of peace groups and how, I'll go into that when we look at that. Palestinian Bassam Aramin tells us about his process of resistance, first as a child to the physical and personal humiliations and fear he experienced on the streets in the occupied territories from IDF soldiers. His resistance then was to run away. His fantasy, he's very explicit about it, was to exterminate all Jews, Israelis, soldiers, men, women, children, they were all the enemy. When he was 15 years old, with a group of friends, he threw hand grenades on an Israeli tank, for which he was sentenced to 7 years in an Israeli prison, where he was subjected to physical and emotional torture. He resisted by engaging in dissociation and guided imagery. He took himself outside of the prison. And I think that that's very interesting. I should have said at the beginning that Eyad El-Sarraj was actually going to give a commentary on the film together with Jessica. And one of the things he taught to me, I didn't meet Eyad, but I did have 2 long telephone conversations with him. And he talked about the value of dissociation and the value of guided imagery, if it doesn't become pathological, of course. In prison, his resistance attached to his developing Palestinian identity, whereas previously it had been personal, his own personal identity. Later, he engaged with a prison guard, Shimon, who wondered why a quiet, calm boy like Bassam was a terrorist. They talked for 8 months. This is quite amazing. This prison guard, who's dead now, was apparently vicious. I'm using Bassam's words again, I wasn't there. But nevertheless, he reached out his hand to Bassam and he said, what does a nice, quiet, calm boy like you do being a terrorist? And Bassam says, no, it's not me that's the terrorist, it's you. You are the terrorist, you are the settler, I am a freedom fighter. And they engaged in 8 months, and in the end, 8 months talking, that is, the guard eventually agrees he is the settler and Bassam a freedom fighter. And in our film, we see how significant that was. When I say our film, I'm talking about Bassam's story, of course. We see how significant that was as the beginning of Bassam's non-violence. He said, you can change even the most extreme mind by talking. And that was totally amazing to him. I must say here too that Bassam never became an internal victim, but he is put to test when his 10-year-old daughter is killed after he left prison, of course, by IDF police outside her school. Nevertheless, he refuses to sacrifice again, himself or his children, to revenge or violence. He is not prepared to die. He wants to go on living through his children. He says it is far more powerful, and this is interesting, and painful to the perpetrators to forgive his daughter's killers. So, both Bassam and Itamar became founder members of Combatants for Peace, though neither of them have actually relinquished violence if they consider it would be the moral course. But their identities went through a huge change. Okay, I'm looking now briefly at the similarities of their stories, which I think we can build on in community interventions. Particularly if we look at early child development, ECD, and education. If any of you know any of Daphne Golan's work, then, you know, I think this is, it can go along those lines. So, both of them, from very different family backgrounds, highlighted what Bowlby's secure childhood family attachments, with its secular eye of empathy and recognition of the other, recognition of the pain of the other, and they both talk about how they had suffered pain as children, which had been so comforted by their parents, father and mother. I can't go into it, but you'll see it when you get onto the website. And that is also international research by international researchers show this desire to comfort that children from secure childhood family attachments have as young as the age of 3 in nursery schools. They had parental moral teaching, both of them. Itamar's parents, although his dad was very senior in the IDF pilot, were against the occupation, and they enjoyed respect from the community. Respect was another marquee, another characteristic of their upbringing, and dignity, and their communities respected their families as well. And both of their families apparently had a very strong desire to connect with the community and to help. So we hear their ability to mentalize in their stories. When Bassam's daughter is killed, he says he wants to meet the killer of his daughter, and he says, I want to know what he was thinking. What did it mean to him? I'm sure that he thought he was doing the right thing. I'm sure he thought he was protected. But that, what I'm talking about is Fonagy's mentalization, his ability to mentalize. Their ability to dissociate, which again, Eyad had spoken to me about. An ability for healthy denial, not pathological, and to explore new paths and to act. And those are the seculae as well of the sort of childhood, the childhood upbringing they experience. And their action is both speaking out, and they are out there in the community talking about non-violent action, I suppose. So the video series focuses on these issues in the search for non-violence and stepping out of violence. And stepping out of denial, which to me comes before violence, stepping out of violence. Jessica Benjamin talks about the role of peace groups in providing social witnessing, support, finding a new identity, and transgression. Perhaps she'll have a word to say about that soon. And, of course, all of that is about building a community of sorority, fraternity, intergenerational, what have you. The film team, and we were a very powerful team who worked together over the past 5-6 years, have developed a concept called the ethical mindset with ethical behaviors, which you will find in an interactive diagram. And we, surprisingly, do not believe that empathy is essential for this ethical mindset and ethical behavior. We believe in that. But lucky fellow travelers may encounter Jessica's moral third on their journey. Okay, that's all I want to say. Could you just help me get onto the... I want to click on the thing so people can see what there is. I can't just work smartphones either. put together. It's interactive by two students, postdoctoral students of Aviv, a Palestinian and an Israeli, who are both now teaching in America. Can you click on it? Okay, I'm just about finishing. All right, if you can come back. That's what they all say. Okay, all right. Okay, we go to the next one now. The timeline puts it into the local and global context, the Palestine-Israel conflict. Now, the video series, there are 10 of them, which go through all of the characteristics that I've just been talking about, the whole journey that they went through, which they were going through while we were still talking, of course. Yes, could you just go down a little bit, please? Could you go up, sorry. Go up the other way, the other direction. Come down, yeah. Sorry, bring it down. Okay. All right, so we begin with, the first thing was it's good to die and kill for your country, both of them in their collective narratives of violence and ready to die. How they stepped out of that, I am rushing, okay? There's lots of stuff which is in there. But they then talked about their childhoods, which is when we identify their secure attachment, their recognition and empathy, and then they talk about pain today as adults and pain today as children. They talk about invisibility, not seeing the other. Then we have a chapter on death of a child, which is Bassam, and the death is when his daughter was killed. Children and sacrifice, he refuses to revenge. He's already at such a stage of non-violence, he just simply refuses to revenge. Itamar then spoke extensively about his loss of his ideology of Zionism, of the army, of the education. I'm finishing. Okay. Yeah.
Just tell them where to look.
Okay, all right. So, okay, there's one more thing. Can you just go back to one more thing, which is the diagram? Just go to the diagram over there. You'll see workshops. They are workshop aims, there's teaching aims, co-creating a safe base. Teaching resources are very rich. Go to the MVV diagram. It's next to workshops, the one before workshops. The other way. Go back. That's the one. Thank you. This is an interactive diagram which is about how we move into the ethical mindset and ethical behavior. It's one pathway, and we look forward to hearing yours too. So where is you've got the website at the top. At the moment, it is free to download this website. We would love to have your feedback and your comments. In future, we'll be asking for a donation for it. So use it now while you can. And enjoy. Thank you.
Now, the time you've all been waiting for, ladies and gents. This is the free discussion. I would like to make two suggestions, and unless it's too difficult. All you guys in the cheap seats, can you come down here so that we won't have to use microphones? No, it's impossible. Arnona and Nimmer, when you come down here, you will lead the discussion. This is Arnona, I know Arnona.
אני מזיזה את זה כמה שאני יכולה, אני לא מצליחה. יש איזה סוג של בריחה קלה.
We're having discussion. Please hold on. There will be time for some of us to talk. I think Nima Saeed and Manula Zahavi will be talking. We decided that we'll be talking in English. Anybody is invited to use the language comfortable for you, and if anybody would like to translate, we'll also have translation. So we'll have whatever goes on here. What I would like to ask, if we're trying to make some kind of a large group here, so whoever is sitting in the center, can you move to the sides so that you can turn back when somebody is speaking in the back. So those in the middle, just move. We'll have some kind of a circle. Yeah. So, okay, so now we'll check how flexible everybody is in turning around and listening and speaking to each other. I want to start, like everybody today, from my few personal encounters with Eyad El-Sarraj. I think the first time I heard him, I think it was in the old Cinematheque here. You were with Eyad, and there was an Irish post-rebel. Do you remember? About 10 or 15 years ago. Was it the 15? Okay. And what I want to say, and I'm not saying it just from a personal place, but as a bridge from the morning to the discussion, is that for me, Eyad was an emblem of being able to hold on to complexity. Complexity and a sort of curiosity towards the other. And I must say that in this morning, I'm saying it from my personal point of view, and everybody's invited to say where you are, whoever gets a microphone and speak, but I kind of felt that the complexity is getting lost. And I'd like to bring it back. We're not here to, of course, we'll listen to whoever speaks, but now is the time to try and engage and to think if anybody can bring up what they're taking from here, but also where they're taking it. Because, again, on my personal level, I felt that maybe the invisible in this room isn't the Palestinian, aren't the Gazans, who are very invisible in the Western world, in Israel, but the invisible person for me was myself as an Israeli leftist activist. Nobody talked to me. People talked over my head this morning. And it was very difficult to me to hold on to that. And I think I need the help of the complexity. So this is my point of view, and we have the microphone so we can start, and then it's your floor and your circle.
Actually, I don't want to be voicing myself as blaming the organizers, but I think taking this day as an organizational event or as a temporary organization, I think the experiential part of this event was a bit misused, and seeing this experiential timing right now, what we're doing right now, is delayed and belated to the end of the day. It means that whether in the unconscious mind of the organizational event, whether this is not important or whether this is important and a bit misused or abused. So there's a need, in a way, for an experiential thing to be done, and maybe this for the futuristic planning of the content that we are all gathered here today.
Okay. And Efrat is with the microphone, so whoever raises your hands, you'll have to be patient, and Efrat will.
Better to ride with him or
You're very conveniently seated next to each other. And maybe state your name and where you're from, if it's okay.
Thanks. My name is Mark. I'm from England, and I've been living in Jerusalem for 14 years. What I'm going to say only partially conforms to the standards you just set out. I actually just have a question for Jessica Benjamin about something that you said about the victim identity is something. You don't mind? I mean, this isn't a question and answer. Do you mind me putting you on the spot? The victim identity is something to be avoided. That's one of the conditions you said. But the victim has moral high ground and can bring things together. So I just was wondering how one negotiates that in practice. One knows that one is in the position of the victim without taking on an identity.
No, please don't answer yet. Okay, maybe please let people who didn't speak on the stage speak first, and then we'll give time for answers.
Anyways, my question is not related specifically to your lecture, so I think it is important that you will answer now if that's okay with everyone.
I really prefer that people could just share where they are and what they're thinking, and we'll leave time for responses to the end. I think we'll miss out on the engagement here if we engage with the lecturers now. So please say whatever you have to say, but don't have to wait.
So my name is